hard enough just doing this. If I also had to make everything I ate, it would be impossible, or I'd need far more resources than I have. It also wouldn't be as effective, I don't think, for trying to prove my point, because I wanted to demonstrate you can go to the grocery store and get a lot of this stuff. It's not something you need to like dedicate all your free time to making it, or you can't be part of the world of fermentation. Again, it's ubiquitous and it's part of the food we eat all the time, so like I really wanted to demonstrate that this is not something that like only freakish shut-ins with a weird obsession for bacteria can participate in. It's everywhere. Like you can go to the grocery store, a lot of this stuff's out there. But it was hard to still make a lot of the stuff that I made. I still made a lot, obviously, and like really dabble in, especially like the smaller, more esoteric experiments that weren't vital for me having lunch the next day. Yeah. So like there were certain things where it's just like hard to allocate the resources to taking the time, and I got through a lot of experiments that I wanted to do, but it was hard to get to all of them. And some of them are more challenging, some of them require a lot more attention than others. The nice thing about, like, I can theoretically do a veggie fermentation for you tonight. I always feel, I think I'm more enjoying just kind of a Q&A back and forth thing. I always feel a little weird doing veggie fermentation demonstrations, because like I've done a lot of beer brewing demonstrations, and those it's like just, pots, and you're doing all these visual things and going through these parts of the process. Doing a veggie fermentation demonstration, I'm like, so this is how you cut up carrots, and you put them in a jar. I'm assuming you guys aren't that stupid.
Water and salt.
Water and salt, yeah. So it's like, it's kind of more of a visual element, and I can describe the whole process, and that's really more, the important thing is like I'll describe what to expect when you're expecting fermented carrots, but like the part where I'm just carving up carrots and putting them in a jar is not super important to demonstrate to you.
I've always wondered, what does the brine do that's fermentation? It's not bacterial, right? I mean...
Excellent question. So the key thing when you're fermenting veggies is the kind of foundation of understanding veggie fermentation. A lot of it comes down to whether you're making a brine or creating a brine and what that brine does. And understanding that is usually going to make a difference between when you get a moldy batch of sauerkraut or veggies and when it comes out well. So the brine is kind of adding a protective barrier for the fermentation. It's also allowing the fermentation to happen at all. So I use that analogy of this is like a battlefield that we're taking a side in. The way we're doing that with veggie fermentation, similar to beer. In beer, you're using sanitation and isolating a yeast strain, putting it in a bucket with an airlock and not allowing anything else to get in there. That's favoring the Saccharomyces or whatever other yeast to be able to do its thing in the environment of beer. And we've kind of eliminated the competition for it. With veggie fermentation, most other, outside of booze, most other fermentations with veggies are much more akin to wild fermentation, because we're not sanitizing the carrots. We're not pitching yeast to it, we're not pitching bacteria to it. The microbes are already living on the produce, on the vegetables. They're covering all food all the time pretty much, and in the case of veggies, fermentation happens. Like it's already waiting to happen, it's already staged. All we have to do is give it an environment that allows those microbes to thrive. So with veggie fermentation, the lactobacillus that's living on the skin of the carrots, on the sauerkraut, or on the cabbage, on the beets, whatever we're fermenting, the lactobacillus just needs an anaerobic environment, so free of oxygen. It's also helped by salt. Salt helps ward off pathogenic bacteria or other microbes that we don't want. The lactobacillus is perfectly happy in that environment. So it just needs a brine, it needs a liquid environment, because if you just take the carrots, throw them in a jar, and there's no brine, there's no anaerobic environment, the aerobic environment, the environment free of oxygen, or the environment rich in oxygen, is just going to encourage mold to grow. The carrots are going to turn to mush and rot, the same way that happens if you leave them out in the fridge for too long. That's why when you leave vegetables out in the fridge and forget about them for 2 weeks, they don't turn into sauerkraut. They just get disgusting and mushy and rot. Because in that case,
fermentation though, right?
It is still, fermentation is hard to define. There really isn't a strict bulletproof definition for fermentation, because if we ate that, it would be considered fermentation because we don't, it's not like almost any definition you come up with for fermentation, there's like one thing out there that works as the counterexample and doesn't fit in that definition. And so you keep broadening the definition of fermentation until you're like, well, I think you're just describing life. It's pretty much what you like, at certain points, it's just like, okay, microbes are everywhere and they're alive and they're doing things and they eat stuff.
Right, you get the flu, you're fermenting.
Right, yeah, kind of. I mean, like our bodies are sort of like, we eat food and the microbes in our stomach are fermenting it and creating waste and we're releasing gas and it's like the same process that's behind almost everything. So the brine is essentially just, that's our role to play. That's setting the stage for the favorable microbes. So the lactobacillus, which are already there, are like, oh, hey, cool, all right, we can win this battle. There's salt, there's an oxygen-free environment. So as soon as you create that brine, and you're just, like if I was doing this as a full elaborate workshop, all I would do is cut up carrots. For a jar this size, it's like 1.5 tablespoons of salt. And you want to use sea salt or kosher salt. You just don't want to use salt with any kind of preservatives in it. So you generally don't want to use table salt, which would have iodine in it. You're just cutting up the carrots, and really any veggie. This process applies to pretty much any vegetable you can think of, and it pretty much translates no matter what you're doing. Cutting them up, putting them in a jar, and you're just topping the jar up with water. Which, all right, I'll do it. It's easy.
See your
Show me how that works.
Yeah, all
You
right.
have the kosher salt?
It's, yeah. Again, like, I feel like this is like kind of insulting to you, but
So that's how you.
I'm using a special Japanese method that I had to practice for 2 years. Balls dropping stuff on the floor. So I just went down the street and got carrots from the nearest grocery store I could find. I've been asked a lot at a lot of like readings and stuff. Obviously, this applies to very health conscious people. So the quality of the produce is generally first thing in their mind. And people usually ask, like, does it have to be organic? Do I have to get it from a farmer's market? Like, what happens if I'm not using organic vegetables? And obviously, it's organic is great, and it's great to use organic if you can. A lot of people in the country don't have access to amazing farmers markets, and the nice thing about fermentation, if you can get organic, that's great. If you can go right down the street to the farmers market, that's great. If you can't, it still works. If you just have a tiny little grocery store that's nothing fancy nearby, and that's where you get your produce, it should still work. There's still, as long as the vegetables aren't rotten, as long as they're not on their way to decomposing, the microbes are still going to be living on the skin of them. And even if it's not organic produce, it's still going to ferment. And it's actually important to remember for all the people in the country, in the world that live in food deserts, in urban environments that don't have good grocery stores, that can't afford to go down to the farmer's market or to Whole Foods. This is a really important process for adding nutritional value to food, and it does work with food that's not necessarily ideal, that might not be organic. So it is a really important process for adding nutritional value and preserving foods that are not necessarily of the best quality. So it kind of works across the board, and it's more important than just like, oh, don't do it unless it's organic. It's more important than that. And it'll work as long as one of the only times I've had like a really disastrously moldy veggie ferment that I just had to throw out was I went to a good grocery store up by me in the Hudson Valley. I got some green beans to make like a spicy diddly bean kind of ferment. And the green beans I got at the time were a little past their prime. And I was making a bunch of things, and I was like, well, these sort of seem a little old maybe, but I was kind of in a hurry, not paying a ton of attention, and I figured, the fermentation might salvage them. But they were, in retrospect, too far gone. When I was putting them in the jar, I noticed a lot of them had that kind of part of them was like kind of mushy and like squishes between your fingers and is already kind of decomposing. If it's that far gone, it probably will still ferment. It'll probably still pickle in the way you're going for. but it is very likely to also grow mold because you've already started down the other path. You're already started with the opposing forces of microbial control. So it can be both. It can be rotten and fermented at the same time. Again, the actual microbes don't really care what terminology they're using or you're using. They're just competing for resources. So both sides can sometimes get the resources. All right. So it doesn't matter how you cut them up. You can cut them into French fry looking sticks. You can cut them into discs. You can make origami animals out of them. You can, as long as they fit in the jar and they're under the brine, everything has to be under the brine, and that's really like all we're going for here. If it's poking out the top, it's exposed to oxygen, right? If it's not under the brine, it's exposed to the air, and that's where you get mold and mushy, gross vegetables. I was going to say before with the organic thing, whatever. You can just like rinse them off in the sink. I'm not bothering with these because they look pretty clean. If there's dirt on them, it's not like the dirt's necessarily going to ruin it, but you also probably like don't want to eat dirt.
Do you not have to sanitize the jar? Because when I do kimchi, I can do it just because of my own brain.
You can. I mean, yeah, I know. I struggle with that instinct too because I had years of training as a home brewer.
Yeah.
Where like, oh, sanitize everything.
Yeah.
And this almost like made me more carefree as a home brewer. I was like, why am I sanitizing this?
Okay, so it's good to be clean though, right?
Certainly.
Yes.
Like you want to be clean, you might as well wash your hands. Certainly wash the jar. Like you don't want like spider webs in it or something.
But I feel I usually spray it with Star Sands and like I do like a.
It's not going to hurt, but I've never done that. You don't need to you want to be clean, but you don't need to be sanitary. So you can wash the vegetables in the sink. You can wash wash your hands. You don't want grime and dirt, whatever, but
They taste bad.
yeah, but the jar does not need to be spotless. Like I just pretty much you reuse the same jars and pick out one that's clean and
We let this
I've
water
never-
sit out a little bit just because I figured that some of the chlorine would dissipate.
Right.
I can see chlorine being not good tasting.
yeah, chlorine is not ideal. New York City obviously has pretty good water. Like if it's
You can keep that.
that's if it's good for making beer, if it's good for drink. I mean, the philosophy with beer is usually if you drink it, it's probably fine to brew with it, more or
John
less.
Palmer would say different.
Right.
You would?
And he does.
Yeah.
How so?
Yes. Because the mineral content of water affects the mash.
But I agree with you.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah. I mean,
That
you
per
can
brewer.
you can adjust the water makeup,
Right.
but like it's not like you have to throw out the water because it's If it tastes good, if there's not a lot of something really off-putting in it, you can probably figure out a way to brew with it. And with veggie fermentation, like the mash pH and all that, like that's not a concern here, so it's even less of a big deal.
I don't do that when I brew anymore.
Right. Like if your water smells like sulfur, I would probably filter it. Like I wouldn't.
Like Pennsylvania.
Right.
Like Pennsylvania water.
But yeah, so otherwise the water is like, you just don't want anything that like might kill the microbes in it or taste bad.
Or kill you.
Yeah.
Does distilled water help? Like, would you, or is that?
It's fine, yeah.
But it isn't like stunt fermentation if you use distilled or not.
It's probably better to have water that has some minerals in it.
Yeah.
I think it would be more ideal. I don't know that distilled's gonna like prevent it from fermenting because the carrots, whatever you're fermenting probably has enough going on already. But yeah. So yeah. All right. So I got carrots in a jar. Again, this can be beets. Beets are easy. I was gonna try and make one ferment I really like is like a carrot, parsnip, ginger pickle. Really good. It gets like a little bit of spiciness to it. It's kind of zesty and zingy and very flavorful. And it's a good example of like, to be perfectly honest, I don't really eat carrots much on their own. Kind of find them a little boring. But fermented, they're really good, and I like them a whole lot more. And this carrot, parsnip, ginger thing is like, three things on their own that are like not necessarily the most exciting foods in the world. But one of my favorite things when they're fermented is you get this whole other dynamic range of flavors that just not just adding nutritional value to it, but adding culinary value and flavor to what you're making. So there are actually a bunch of recipes in the back of the book. This is in there. The carrot, parsnip, ginger is in there. A whole bunch of other ones. I tried to include like the less obvious and the more creative like things I came up with on my own kind of recipes. They didn't have parsnips, so I'm just doing carrots because again, this is so simple. Yeah, so measure out. So if you were just doing like a small pint jar, and you don't have to be, all of this is, you know, if you couldn't tell already, a lot less precise than if you're homebrewing beer. It's a lot more, you know, there's a lot more wiggle room, a lot more buffer for kind of, so you don't necessarily have to be like spot on with the measuring out salt or anything, like you're not going to necessarily ruin it. There's kind of a window that you want to be in. Too little or too much salt can inhibit the fermentation or not inhibit the competing microbes enough. So you do want to be kind of in this like sweet spot, but if you're, you know, a little off in one direction or the other, it's probably not going to be a big deal. So I do like a tablespoon and a half for this size jar, and you can just kind of like obviously scale that up with common sense depending on, you know, if you're doing a big jar like this, that might be 2.5 tablespoons. If you're doing a pint jar, a little under a tablespoon or something. It's not baking. Yeah.
They obviously didn't keep that in a moisture-free environment.
Probably got some microbes of its own.
Probably does.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. If you didn't have that, I was just gonna like eyeball it because again,
We're a precision shop.
yeah. Okay. All right. The watch closely here.
You came all the way from Connecticut to show us.
See what I did there? Wow. All right. So the more important parts of this are in the 2-3 weeks to come. So so you can see, obviously the carrots are under the brine. Can't stress enough, that is kind of just really the main thing that you need to watch out for. Carrots floating out of the brine, beets, sauerkraut, whatever floating out of the brine, very good chance that's going to grow mold, anything that is exposed to the air. Again, with wild fermentation of veggies, you can really nanny it a lot more than with beer. You don't need to be as kind of gentle and timid with the environment. So with beer, you know, we'll tell you just kind of let it do its thing. Don't fuss with it too much. With beer, you don't want to be opening up the bucket and poking your finger in every day because you're probably going to get something in there that's going to contaminate it. That's not really a concern with veggie fermentation, and I would actually encourage you to open it up at least once a day for the first week or so, and to kind of baby the fermentation. That's actually, I find, the best way to avoid getting mold growth. Because you poking your finger in there, like, all you're doing is just contributing probably the same bacteria, or, you know, unless your hands are like home to some really nasty bacteria. But generally, like, we ourselves are home to the same good bacteria that we want to eat in our fermented foods, which is probably the reason why we want to eat those in our fermented foods, because there's this whole symbiotic relationship between these bacteria and us. Lactobacillus bacteria, again, the things that sour gozas and lambics and carrots and yogurt and sauerkraut and pepperoni also live already in the human body. So they are naturally, you know, our bodies are naturally home to these same bacteria that make half of our foods. So you poking your finger in there and pushing carrots back down is going to help favor a good fermentation a lot more than if the carrots were just constantly floating out of the brine and being exposed to air. So that's what I encourage, is like probably the easiest, surefire way to get a good fermentation is just make sure everything's in the brine. Just check it every day. You don't necessarily have to open it up, but you want to keep. So now the fermentation is kind of going mainstream, and a lot more people are doing it and getting into it. Obviously, a lot of businesses are making more specialized equipment, so there's a lot of things out there now that you can buy specialized equipment for fermenting veggies. I kind of just stick with the, you know, straightforward mason jar and lid thing because it's simple and cheap, and need to, you know, spend a lot of money to get set up for it. You shouldn't feel like you need to go out and spend, you know, $100 on a crock or some fancy elaborate jar system with weights. You can, and that's fine, and they usually work well, but you really can do with just a mason jar and lid that cost you a couple bucks.